Hi, and welcome to the 24th installment of the DAD Project. Tonight, as promised, we'll look at the plane that was developed to overcome an ever more sophisticated undersea nemesis, the submarine. It was the outgrowth of the continual development of aircraft to find and destroy that nemesis. For my dad, Pete Purvis, submarine hunting was nothing new. Way back in Installment 6, we were introduced to the Grumman S2F, an airplane that was specifically developed to combine the hunter-killer method of sub-hunting into one airframe. For well over 1,600 hours, my dad flew search grids off the East Coast and over the North Sea in the S2F, before the needs of the Navy put him on a completely different course. The S2F was specifically designed to operate off aircraft carriers, while tonight's spotlight falls on the P3 Orion, that was strictly a land-based patrol aircraft, as the P denotes. So let's warm our coffee, sit back, and take a look at the genesis of the patrol aircraft, the P3 Orion in particular, what makes the P3 special, and my dad's tangential relationship with the Orion. But first, you know the drill, let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
The submarine as an invention was one that made its first appearance in 1562 in the city of Toledo, when two Greek men submerged several times without getting wet while holding candles that remained lit. It was around this time as well that several Frenchmen, with the aid of a much larger flame, would show off their hot air balloons over Paris. This seemingly dichotomous set of endeavors, with two Greek men attempting to swim with the fishes, while our Frenchmen sought to soar with the birds, would remain divergent interests until the outbreak of World War I and the rise of the German U-boat. The wheels that would lead to World War I had been turning long before Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated on July 28, 1914 in Sarajevo. So the war that started officially when the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war a mere month later would force a series of treaties to be enforced and enjoined by their members. The lines were quickly drawn, and the Germans found themselves choked by the British naval blockade, beginning in early 1915. The German surface navy did not have the wherewithal to overcome the far superior British surface navy, but their submarines proved effective in their role as merchant raiders. Initially, as the Germans were sure of quick victory, the U-boat captains observed the prize rules and would stop merchant ships, inspect the ship, safely remove the crew, and then sink the boat. As a stalemate settled horribly over the continent and victory was far from sure, early in 1915 the German Admiralty instructed their U-boat captains to sink merchant ships, including neutral ones, without warning. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania, a passenger ship of the British Cunard Line, was sunk by the German submarine U-20, with the loss of 1,200 men, women, and children. Among those dead were 128 Americans. So concerned were the Germans that the sinking might draw the U.S. into the war against them that the U-boats were ordered to spare passenger ships and neutral merchant vessels. This order would be short-lived. As 1917 dawned, the British blockade had put a stranglehold on the German economy, and food shortages had become endemic. The war, moreover, was not going well for Germany and her allies, so the German High Command unfettered its 140 U-boats to resume unrestricted attacks on all shipping in the Atlantic and the Channel. Although still fearing an American entry into the war because of the resumption of the unrestricted attacks, the German High Command had hoped to break the blockade and knock Britain out of the war within a year before the U.S. could mobilize and land troops in Europe. Even before the return to unrestricted attacks, the U-boats had sunk an incredible 30% of the world's merchant ships, and in April of 1917, the U-boats had sunk over 800,000 tons of shipping alone. Remarkable, but it proved all for naught as the U.S. declared war in April of 1917, with the unrestricted U-boat warfare being one of the reasons given for the U.S. entry into the war. The contemporary picture of submarines doesn't wander much past a modern nuclear stealthy submersible that can remain underwater for as long as their supplies will last, a picture that was painted by movies like The Hunt for Red October. Before the arrival of the first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, in 1954, a movie like Das Boot or Run Silent, Run Deep gives a far more accurate picture of the submarine, the diesel submarine. U-boats are better described as boats that can submerge when necessary. Through World War II, the typical sub ran on the surface propelled by its diesel engines, more than it did with its batteries underwater. Most of the merchant ships sunk in World War I was taken out by U-boats running on the surface firing its deck gun, because the torpedoes were unreliable. The main defense against the U-boat would be the convoy, but was originally dismissed because it was thought that an enemy battle group could quickly dispense with a densely packed group of merchant ships. As it became apparent that a submarine would be the merchant navy's greatest nemesis, particularly those ships that sailed alone, convoy tactics were suggested but were quickly dismissed. Furthermore, it was felt that capital ships playing nursemaid to a plotting group of cargo ships was a waste of those ships' true calling, dramatic blue water over the horizon gun battles. So it wouldn't be until April of 1917 that convoys as a tactic were tested, and it wouldn't be until September of that year that convoys would finally be adopted. But what of our dichotomous friend, the airplane? As already noted, the embryonic stages of the submersible and flight began around the same time. Their full realization as weapon systems would come to fruition as the 20th century got a full head of steam with the outbreak of World War I, so once again around the same time. Like the forward thinkers that recognized the potential of airplanes as bombing platforms, others had recognized the danger that submarines would present to shipping, both military and merchant. In 1912, Lieutenant H.A. Williamson of the Royal Navy, who was both a submarine officer and a flight officer, presented a paper that suggested that aircraft be used for submarine patrol because of their distinct height advantage over a ship's lookout. His paper would lead the Royal Navy to experiment with the viability of Williamson's proposition. These experiments would continue until the outbreak of the war, whereupon they become live fire exercises. Weather and night flying would, like every other development with aircraft, plague their use with battling the submarine scourge. On the whole, anti-submarine flights were flown during the day and only as the weather permitted. Little could be done about the weather, but, like their land-based brethren, night flying aids were introduced that by 1918 would allow anti-submarine flights to happen at night when the U-boats would be running on the surface and spotted. For the most part, the business of anti-submarine warfare during this period was one that required the U-boat to be seen by the pilot or his spotter. Finding a submerged submarine was near impossible. However, a great deal of time and money was spent by the British Board of Invention and the Admiralty on the development of hydrophones to detect submarines underwater. These hydrophones were initially developed for use on surface ships. Two distinct problems resulted in the early deployment of hydrophones. One, they were omnidirectional, so they would alert the ship to a submarine in the vicinity, but not where it was. Secondly, the U-boat could usually hear the pursuer long before a hydrophone could be deployed, and the U-boat would go silent. A potential solution was to equip flying boats and seaplanes with hydrophones. The engine noise emitted by these craft on the water was minimal, so the sub could be detected without the sub knowing the plane was there. Several problems arose, but the most difficult one, again, was that the early hydrophones were omnidirectional, and getting the plane back in the air to possibly locate the sub was problematic. It wouldn't be until bidirectional hydrophones were introduced in May of 1917 that a seaplane could land, locate the sub, and then direct squadron mates still aloft to the submerged sub. The hunter-killer model of anti-submarine warfare had been introduced. The upshot of these early and primitive developments of anti-submarine warfare aircraft was that during 1918 no convoy escorted by an air patrol lost a ship, and the U-boats were consistently forced to dive where they became blind and immobile after being spotted by the patrolling aircraft. So what was the payback to all this effort, invention, and development? As a singularity, there was very little payback, since of the 202 U-boats sunk during the war, only one U-boat, the UB-32, was sent to the bottom by a patrolling aircraft acting alone. A fact that would shade military thinking into the next war. It would be assumed that anti-submarine warfare by aircraft was only effective in conjunction with surface ships and the convoy system, and that the patrol plane was of minimal value, hunting and destroying submarines operating alone. On the whole, however, aircraft were seen as a valuable asset to curb and curtail U-boat operations going forward. Technological systems like hydrophones, tactics like the hunter-killer method to find and destroy the submarine, the continued development of night-flying systems and navigation systems for flying over wide expanses of unmarked bodies of water would make aircraft far more capable at the outbreak of World War II. However, it would be several systems that were being developed towards the end of World War I that would truly make the U-boat's life far more difficult in the coming conflict: sonar, radar, and MAD. Following World War II, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." The Battle of the Atlantic, that would be fought from 1939 until the end of the conflict, was the longest continuous military campaign of the war. Immediately following Britain's declaration of war, Britain announced a naval blockade of Germany, just as they had in World War I. The German response, just as they had in World War I, was to announce a counter-blockade that pitted their U-boats, surface ships of the Kriegsmarine, and aircraft of the Luftwaffe against the Allies. It was a punch-counterpunch battle if ever there was one. Initially, the U-boats had the upper hand, sinking merchant vessels at a rate that couldn't be replaced. Most concerning was that the majority of vessels being sunk were sunk while sailing in convoys, the convoy being the most effective deterrent to U-boat attacks during the Great War. It wouldn't be until late in 1942 and early 1943 before the tide began to turn. The Allies' success was not the result of any approach or system, but many. The escort carrier and long-range patrol aircraft are two examples, although the most important weapon of the Battle of the Atlantic was intelligence. The vaunted Enigma machine, the German cipher device, had been broken, and nearly all coded transmissions from the German Admiralty to their subs could be read. It's a fascinating story, but one we'll leave for someone else to tell. Like most military systems, the idea of the escort carrier was nothing new. The British Royal Navy had floated the idea of trade protection carriers in the 1930s, but lack of funds and an immediate threat sunk the idea. So, when Admiral Halsey recommended the construction of naval auxiliaries for pilot training in 1940, it morphed into the Auxiliary Aircraft Escort Vessels by 1942, and the Escort Aircraft Carrier, or CVE, was born. These boats were not of the hardiest stock and were derisively referred to as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. And although they were initially meant as protection from long-range German patrol aircraft, they would ultimately be the genesis of the sea-based airborne anti-submarine warfare platform in the hunter-killer role. This combination was able to sink 42 German submarines, and most importantly, they provided both protection from air and underwater threats for the entirety of a convoy's crossing. At the outbreak of the war, the U.S. Navy was ill prepared for the submarine threat close to our shores, let alone far out into the Atlantic. And the first CVE deployed to escort a convoy in the North Atlantic wouldn't be until March of 1943. So unprepared was the Navy that the initial long-range patrol aircraft used were Army Air Force B-24s. As the war progressed, these duties were turned back over to the Navy, but like World War I, U-boat sinkings by singular patrol aircraft were rare and often in favor of the U-boat. At least 57 U.S. aircraft were shot down by U-boats, compared to only 12 U-boats lost in these attacks. The RAF Coastal Command alone lost 700 aircraft that were badly damaged, shot down, or written off after encounters with U-boats. But no matter who was doing the shooting, bombing, or sinking, the cost of victory was staggering. For the entirety of the campaign, 3,500 merchant ships and 175 Allied warships were sunk, with 72,200 souls lost, while the Germans would lose 783 U-boats and 30,000 of the 40,000-man submarine force. Following the war, the Navy's approach to anti-submarine warfare would be two-pronged. One was the hunter-killer approach that was developed aboard the CVEs and improved throughout the war. The final hunter-killer carrier duo would be the Grumman Guardian before the Navy put out an RFP for a carrier-based aircraft that could handle both sides of the coin. This would result in the Grumman S2F-1 tracker, an aircraft my dad became very familiar with. But tonight, we're interested in the other prong, the patrol aircraft that were developed to operate from land bases. During World War II, patrol aircraft were of every ilk and type. Many were based on existing airframes like the B-17 and B-24, or purpose-built as seaplanes like the PBY and the Martin Marlin. In Installment 9, we took a look at the Lockheed P-3 Neptune, the Navy's post-war purpose-built patrol aircraft that served for nearly 38 years with the U.S. Navy and would overlap with tonight's subject, the P-3 Orion. My dad's 418 hours in the P-2V was spent flying very low over the Canadian Arctic, recording temperature variations for Operation Freezeup and Thaw-Out, a temperature and climatic environmental survey of northern Canada, and ferry flights, not a submarine in sight. Unlike the P-2V, the P-3 would be an outgrowth of an existing aircraft, the first American turboprop airliner, the Lockheed L-188 Electra. Not surprisingly, the first turboprop airliner was British, the Vickers-Viscount. By the time the first Electra flew in 1957, Lockheed had 129 orders in hand. Eastern Airlines took the first delivery in 1958, and it entered service in 1959. From there, it was all downhill. 3 aircraft would crash within a year, and the FAA limited the speed of the remaining aircraft until the problem was found. Long story short, a complicated oscillation of the outboard engines at full cruise power could reach a point of resonance with the outboard wing panels and, in the worst case, tear the wings off. Lockheed quickly implemented a fix. All the planes that had already been produced were repaired at the company's expense, and the fix incorporated on the aircraft then on the production line. However, public confidence had been lost, and production ended in 1961 after only 170 had been built. Although the $100 million in losses from the fix and the lawsuits was a difficult pill to swallow, the Orion's success would make it almost painless. In August of 1957, the Navy issued Type Specification No. 146, which contained the requirements for a new long-range maritime patrol aircraft. Of particular importance was more cabin space, a greater operational radius, and longer endurance than the P-2V. Furthermore, Type Specification No. 146 asked for a short development period and a low-cost price per aircraft. Low cost is a relative term in military systems, but the short development period assured that the resulting aircraft would be born from an existing airframe. Lockheed would base their design Model 185 on the Electra. The Allison turboprop engines were proven and had been in use on the C-130 since 1954. These turboprops were ideal for high cruise speed to reach its operational area and low fuel consumptions during low-level, low-speed missions while on station. Developing and building a similar aircraft like their P-2V doesn't always guarantee its replacement, but in this case it did, and Lockheed was awarded the contract on October 7, 1958 to modify its engineering mock-up into the YP3-1 that would include all the equipment selected for the P-3 and to meet all the conditions laid out in the type specification. After removing 7 feet of the fuselage forward of the wing, Buno 148276, otherwise known as YP3V-1, flew as a proof of concept for a year before the Navy ordered 7 pre-production aircraft that would be turned over to the Naval Air Test Center at Pax River for the first phase of the Navy Preliminary Examination, NPEs. On June 16, 1962, the P3V Orion was declared ready for squadron operations, 5 years after Type Specification No. 146 was issued. The 757 P3s built far outstripped the production run of the Electra. The Orion's anti-submarine and anti-ship capabilities were and still are second to none. All the singular capabilities and developments that came out of the 2 world wars to then be shoehorned into the P-2V following the end of World War II were comfortably integrated into the Orion. This airframe that was initially designed to comfortably fly 80 passengers from point A to point B would be truncated, jammed with electronics, given a bomb bay, hardpoints on the wings, with a crew of 11, to hunt, identify, and destroy submarines and ships. The menu of available hunting and killing devices would include sonar, radar, MAD, bottom mines, rising mines, torpedoes, depth charges, the Harpoon, the Maverick, sonobuoys, a nuclear depth charge for that sunny, apocalyptic day, and no doubt I've left something out. So again, my dad would be skimming the wavetops, having left his noisy, oil-dripping S2 behind, for his jet-fueled, turbopropped beauty to return to his early sub-hunting days. Right? Well, yes and no. While attached to the Naval Air Test Center, following his graduation from the Navy Test Pilot School just across the road, he would spend 14 months in the Service Test Division in the ASW branch. For reasons only known to the dark, enigmatic workings of the Navy, his time in that branch was to fly ASW aircraft for operations that had very little to do with ASW. In Installment 9, I described his time flying the P-2V 1,000 feet and lower over the boreal forests above the Arctic Circle, measuring temperature differentials for Operation Freezeup and Thaw-Out. In Installment 6, I describe his nearly 2 years flying the S2F for the Navy's development of the Fulton Skyhook air retriever system for carrier use. My dad told me it was a system to retrieve downed pilots, but it was eventually used for extraction of covert operators until helicopters took over the job. For the most part, his time in the P3 would be no different. By the time my dad entered service test, NPE 1, 2, and 3 had been completed, as well as the Board of Inspection and Survey, and in June of 1962, the P3 was deemed suitable for Navy patrol squadrons. This would be just in time for the P3 and its Navy sibling, the RF-8, to receive their baptisms of fire during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what was left for my father to do? There are 3 divisions you could be assigned to once you graduated from test pilot school: flight test, weapon tests, and service test. As each class stoically awaited to find out how they would be assigned, they were all quietly repeating this mantra: flight test, flight test. Not that the other opportunities lacked the thrill of test flying, but as my dad described its assignment, service test, it was cats and dogs work: aeromedical equipment, cockpit design, and engine performance. Or, in other words, from the mundane to the esoteric. August 13, 1963, a 5-hour flight for the XRM-139A engine oil evaluation. Other than most of the flight at night, mundane. March through August of 63, engine vibration monitor evaluation. Mundane. But it was engine vibration that caused the wings to separate in the Electra crashes. September through November 1964, he was the pilot project officer for the service evaluation of the angle of attack system. A bit beyond the mundane, as he would get to put this large aircraft into flight envelopes that needed to register on the indicator. Yep, the nose is too high. Nope, the nose is too low. 1964, he was the NATC representative to the P3A NATOPS conference, where the NATC subject was the proper utilization of the angle of attack indicator system in the P3 airplane. Gallons of horrid military-grade coffee and beyond the mundane. November 64, after flying the SP-2E for hundreds of hours very low over the Canadian Arctic, he flew the P-3 as part of Operation Freezeup at 26,000 feet for reasons he doesn't make clear. But other than some beautiful scenery and the northern lights, we'll go with esoteric. And finally, as part of the continuing NPE, he was the project officer and pilot investigating part of the P-3's mine-laying capability. As he described it in his resume, he investigated heavyweight takeoff and landing handling, instrument flight handling with externally mounted stores, night lighting of control panels, and the human factors of engineering suitability of cockpit switchology. Switchology? We'll put this one down as esoteric. And then, on December 8, 1964, after a 9.7-hour return flight from Canada and Operation Freezeup, he shut down the engines for the last time in service test. But, as always, the Navy reserved my dad's multi-engine talents for some later flights. My dad would leave the active duty Navy soon after his return from Vietnam, and as he mustered out, he was assigned to a ferry squadron. While there, he would fly brand new F-4s out of St. Louis, C-54s to Arizona Desert, among others that would also include repositioning P-3As and Bs to Norfolk, Jacksonville, and Alameda. And on October 9, 1968, after a 7.1-hour flight from Pax River to Alameda, with over 200 hours total flight time in the P-3, he would shut down the engines of P-3A Buno 150499 for his last flight in the Orion. So, until next time, thanks for joining me for the 24th installment of the Dad Project. I have several ideas percolating for the next installment, so let's just say we'll all be surprised. And for the 24th time, as many of you already know, I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the ride. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching and enjoy what life is giving you. Ciao.